Hi, welcome to APA's virtual conference of 2020. My name is Tammy Stevens, and I am going to talk to you a little bit today about a COVID-19 impact checklist that I created and some things that I believe is important that you consider during COVID. So some of the considerations and the possible implications of the stressors resulting from COVID, and considering those and considering the impact that those might be having on students' performance. So I'm excited to be here today. I really appreciate you attending this session. I think it's very important for anyone who is thinking about or currently engaged in the evaluation of students. So my name is Tammy Stevens. I am the clinical assessment consultant for Riverside Insights. I have a Ph.D. in special education with an emphasis on assessment. I'm a former assistant professor of special education. I'm an educational diagnostician and a special education teacher. So I've got over 20 years of experience in the area of special education. So the agenda for today's session, I'm going to provide you with a brief look at exclusionary factors. I just want to kind of touch on those and talk about the importance of exclusionary factors. And then I want to really hone in and discuss COVID-19 stressors pertaining to key exclusionary factors. So we'll focus on those exclusionary factors that may be most heavily influenced by the COVID-19 pandemic. And then I'm going to talk about the importance of documenting and considering the implications of these stressors prior to, during, and after formal assessment process. Then from there, I'm going to introduce you to some COVID resources. As I mentioned, I have created the COVID-19 impact checklist, but there's a few other resources that I wanted to show you that a close friend of mine and colleague who's been doing a lot of presentations with me, Georgine Moon, she created a parent questionnaire, teacher questionnaire, and then a student interview form. And then we'll talk about some of the implications and then wrap it up. So let's start off with looking at what exclusionary factors are and why they're important. So if we look at Dawn, Flanagan, Ortiz, and Alfonso's 2013 definition of exclusionary factors, they're potential primary and contributory causes of academic skill weaknesses or deficits that are largely external to the individual, non-cognitive in nature, or the result of a condition other than SLD. Now, those of you that assess students and you look at possible specific learning disabilities, you know the definition of specific learning disability, and you know that there is a portion of that definition that highlights the exclusionary factors. So the term does not include learning problems that are primarily the result of visual, hearing, or motor disabilities, of intellectual disability, of emotional disturbance, or of environmental, cultural, or economic disadvantage. And that's straight out of IDEA. So again, the key word here is the primary result. So you really need to collect the data to determine what is causing, what is the primary cause of the student struggle. So we also need to talk about determinant factors. So determinant factors are part of the referral process at the state. So with me, I live in Texas, so we follow the Texas Administrative Code. And they're also part of the federal level, so the federal regulations. Determinant factors are to be considered prior to and as part of the evaluation. Now, these exclusionary factors and determinant factors should be considered by the student assistance teams or the student referral committee prior to referring the child, and they should be ruled out as being the primary cause of struggle prior to referring the child. But we know that that often is not the case, and that students will be referred even if it appears as though one of those exclusionary factors are the primary cause of struggle. So that's why they also have to be considered as part of the evaluation. So to determine that underachievement in a student suspected of having a specific learning disability is not due to lack of appropriate instruction in reading or math, the following must be considered. So we really want to look at data that demonstrates the student was provided appropriate instruction in reading and or math within general education settings and delivered by qualified personnel. Now, we recognize that qualified personnel, it's hard to determine. But what we typically say is if the teacher is certified teacher, providing the curriculum, that they would be considered qualified personnel. Now we know that you can kind of get in trouble there. There could be, we know there are good teachers. We know there are better curriculums than others. Also, data-based documentation of repeated assessments of achievement at reasonable intervals, reflecting formal evaluation and student progress during instruction. So these are the determinant factors. These are the data that must be considered. So again, when we look at the definition of SLD under IDEA, we have a group of exclusionary factors that have to be ruled out as being the primary reason for the student's struggle. Now, I know we're talking specific to SLD, but I also think given the COVID pandemic, this is important that we look at some of these factors in relation to any student that's being referred regardless of disability area. So this has been something that I've done research on for quite some time, and my colleague Georgine Moon and I created back in 2014 an exclusionary factors checklist. And part of the reason we did this is because the guidance doesn't really provide us with specific definitions of what each of these things are, which makes it pretty subjective, right? There could be individuals who are confused about what's considered a primary cause of the struggle and not really understanding what goes into each of these particular areas. So we did put together this checklist with some guided questions to consider as they're going through the referral process. So this is a snapshot of the 3 areas that we're going to really focus on today because of the COVID pandemic, but the environmental or economically disadvantaged areas, the emotional disturbance area, and then the adequate instruction in reading and math. So the big conundrum now is, should we or shouldn't we assess during COVID-19? Now we know that there are students that were referred prior to COVID, prior to schools closing, that are kind of in the waiting, in the holding pattern. We also have some students who have been referred since virtual instruction has been taking place. So the conundrum from our evaluators is, should we or shouldn't we assess given the COVID-19 pandemic? So some of the concerns and considerations, will referral sources like parents and teachers be able to differentiate between true academic and or behavioral struggle, a possible disability, and the implications of the COVID-19 situation? So will they be able to really understand, tease out what struggles are due to possible stressors of COVID? And one of the things that kind of stands out to me with this particular point is I remember when I was working as a diag, we had Hurricane Katrina hit the New Orleans area. A lot of kids moved to Texas, had lost everything. They'd lost their home, they were uprooted, they lost their friends, no longer in the school that they knew. And at large rates, they were being these individual students were being referred for emotional disturbance. And I remember talking to teachers about, these behaviors were likely due more so to the negative impact that Katrina had on them, and not as much related to a true emotional behavioral disorder. So it's important that we're able to tease those out and really understand the difference between those. We do not want students to be qualified for disability areas when it's not a true disability, but in fact, the implications of the COVID-19 situation. So will current COVID-19 stressors impact the students' performance on tests? That's another key issue. When we look at some of the behaviors, the stressors that our students are experiencing, lack of ability to concentrate, worrying, will those behaviors impact the students' performance on standardized tests? It's something we need to really take in consideration. And then will testing results be valid? So if those stressors are impacting their performance, are the testing results valid? And then will evaluators be able to adequately differentiate between a true disability and the impact COVID has had on the student? So the first bullet was about the referral source being able to differentiate. This bullet is about the evaluator being able to differentiate. And then evaluators need to use a professional and clinical judgment when determining whether to assess or not. So one of the things that I like to point out is that we never make a decision based on a test score alone. So this is a multiple sources of data worksheet that one of my former students and now colleague, Dr. Sarah Holman, created. I'm one of the authors of the core selective evaluation process, the CSEP model, and part of that model places a large emphasis on multiple sources of data and looking at multiple sources of data with your test scores being one piece of the data. So what I highly recommend in all of these situations, regardless, is that we collect as much data on the student as possible. Look at how the student performed prior to COVID, and then how that deviates or is different from how the student's performing during COVID. So this is a resource that we share. If you're interested, I'll give you my email address at the end of this presentation. But it's just a one-page document that allow you to document information, health information, absenteeism or tardiness, whether the student's been retained, if they're LEP or at risk, ethnicity, areas of eligibility, parent information, language, state testing results. And this is a STAR. This is based on Texas. Observation, interview notes, report card grades. You can put in there for multiple years or multiple quarters. Any other testing that's done in the school, teacher information, RTI data, what interventions were implemented, what subject area, frequency, duration, and the results. And then here is a review of educational records, outcome for RTI. Was there an adequate ROI made? Was there slow? So really kind of looking at the students' performance, the rate of improvement over time, strengths and weaknesses in each of these areas, And then here's our exclusionary factors. We want to make sure we do a preliminary rule out of those. And then whether or not the child has had the failure to meet grade level standards. And then we always focus in on a hypothesis statement about what we think is happening with the child. So this is something that the student referral committee could use, or when you obtained the referral from the parent or the school, you could also fill this information in. So let's take a deeper look at specific exclusionary factors that might be additionally impacted by COVID-19. So those are going to be your emotional behavioral, your environmental economic disadvantage, and again, the educational opportunity. And I just want to kind of talk about them and really highlight some things for you to kind of think about. So when we're documenting and considering the impact of COVID-19 on students' academic and behavior, best practice would be for you to delve deeper into understanding what additional stressors a student might be exposed to during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I really advocate that this be done for all students that are being referred or that are in the midst of an evaluation. This will allow you a better understanding of the possible causes of the student's struggle academically or behaviorally, help you understand the impact that those stressors might be having on the student's performance, and then better understand the possible implications that the students, these stressors might have on students' performance on formal measures. And again, these findings should be documented and considered as part of the interpretation process. So when we're looking at the environmental or economically disadvantaged, you know, we know that some of these individuals have limited access to resources and experiences that can impact their performance. Sometimes there's limited supervision. Parents working multiple jobs have less time to spend with the child. Students may have greater responsibilities at home. There's research that shows that students from environmental and economically disadvantaged households have increased exposure to a greater number of risk factors like violence and pollution. There's also limited access to health care and often limited access to nutrition. We also need to really look at the lack of appropriate instruction in reading and math during this COVID pandemic. So what types of research-based instructional practices were used, data-based decision-making. Schools need to strive to avoid being data-rich and information-poor. So really using the data, again, the multiple sources of data, and using that data to make decisions about the student. Looking at what RTI looked like, what interventions were tried, what was the child's rate of improvement on the progress monitoring, were highly qualified teachers delivering curriculum, what was the curriculum, and then also school attendance. So when we talk about appropriate instruction, it's interesting because just as I mentioned with the exclusionary factors, the vagueness in each of the definitions that's provided by the feds, the same thing occurs with appropriate instruction. So this is taken from the federal regs. Whether a child has received appropriate instruction is appropriately left to the state and local officials to determine. Schools have current data-based evidence to indicate whether a child responds to appropriate instruction before determining that the child is a child with a disability. Children should not be identified as having a disability before concluding that their performance deficits are not the result of a lack of appropriate instruction. So they don't really tell us what appropriate instruction is. They leave it up to the state to decide. So some of the ethical implications of disregarding exclusionary factors. Of course, there's that negative effect of being labeled as having a disability when one does not actually exist. So limited English proficiency, identifying a student who has limited English as having a learning disability, or in some cases an intellectual disability because they didn't perform well on a standardized test that's given in English, is not appropriate. So again, there's a reason why these exclusionary factors exist. There's also the increased risk of over-identification of minority students or students from low socioeconomic backgrounds being placed in special education. And this has been something that's been happening for years that we've really tried to battle. Also, there's an increased risk in identifying a student with an emotional behavioral disability when it's actually related to a stressor associated with COVID-19. Again, I told you my experience with the students that were displaced because of Hurricane Katrina. We have to be careful. We have to look at the data. We have to look at it over time to make sure that it is indeed a disability. Also, an inappropriate allocation of resources, and there's many more ethical implications. So since schools have been closed, there's been much discussion from state education agencies, professional groups, school districts, and parent groups about when and how to resume testing. So there's some concerns out there, but we don't have federal guidance and we don't have a definite answer. So one of the major concerns of these groups is that we rush in and test students when school resumes. But we know that there's going to be new issues with the transition from home virtual school back into the brick and mortar schools. So again, this is why we're highly encouraging that you look at those exclusionary factors to determine if there are significant effects of COVID that's going to be impacting the evaluations as we move forward. So in order to better examine the possible changes to our students who have been waiting for their evaluations, or if there's new referrals at parent requests, we really advocate that you use the COVID checklist that I'm going to highlight here in a second. So let's look, before I look at show you the COVID checklist, let's look at the implications before and during COVID, just really quickly. I want to look at the behavioral considerations, environmental and economic disadvantage, and then the lack of instruction. So this is from the American Institute of Stress. These are some of the increased behavioral issues as being reported in students during the COVID-19 pandemic. Difficulty focusing, struggling to relax, extreme emotional reactions such as anger or crying, changes in eating habits, increased refusal to do chores or cooperate with schoolwork at home, increased aggression, the emergence of new or reemergence of old fears, depression, increased need to be physically near a parent or caregiver. These are all issues, these are real. And these are all things that are going to impact our students. When we're looking at emotional behavioral factors, in addition to those, I have on the left-hand side here some of the things that we would ask before COVID and now during COVID. These are some of the new issues. Are there any new or different behaviors? Have they started arguing with siblings or adults, crying, acting out? Have there been issues with loss of appetite, not sleeping or sleeping too much, having nightmares? And then have there been issues with scheduling or self-direction, not completing work, maintaining a schedule, can't focus on the big picture? So again, there's going to be some additional considerations that need to be taken into account. Environmental and economically disadvantaged. So before COVID, we were looking at whether the parent's working multiple jobs, they have limited time. During COVID, is the parent working from home? Was the parent or is the parent an essential worker? And if they are, they're having to work, which would obviously cause stress for the parent and the child. Does the parent still have a job or have they lost their job, which has caused financial stress on the family? Some other things is looking at healthcare. health care? Do they have health care? Is there enough to eat while sheltered in place? Do they have access to the internet and technology? Do they have a parent at home? Are they working at the same time? Do they have a chance to get outside and run around, walk, do some bicycling or play, just to kind of get away from some of the stressors that's going on? Also, we've heard on the news there's been increased exposure to family violence. If they live in a household where there's abuse, there's no, now we're sheltering in place. It's hard to get away from that abuse. Is there increased abuse going on? Crime, pollution, more people living in the home than before, and then are they at risk of becoming homeless again or for the first time because of the parent or caregiver losing their jobs? And then when we look at the academic or developmental issues, do students have a history of academic difficulties, and if so, in what areas? And did the difficulties get worse while working from home? What were the academic strengths? Did they have access to a computer or other device so that they could engage in virtual instruction? Did they have to share their equipment or workspace with other siblings or with adults? So what did that look like? So those are just some considerations. So I want to show you the COVID-19 checklist. This is the parent questionnaire, and this is in order to obtain some information from the parent about the student's performance and behaviors during COVID, and this was created by Georgine Moon. Did your child have virtual classes, work packets, or both? Did your child already have access to the internet? Did they have a designated area to work? Was your child participating in physical activities? How much time did your child spend on core classes daily? So again, just to get some additional information. This is a student interview form. What did you like or dislike about working from home? Before working from home, what classes were easy for you, hard for you? Has that changed since you've been working from home? Did you have access to a computer and internet? Did you have a schedule every day? I think having those routines and schedules is very important. And then this is the impact COVID-19 impact teacher questionnaire. So again, this is something that could be filled out by the new teacher trying to get some information about the students' behaviors when school started back up. Was the student reluctant to enter the building or classroom on the first day of school? Is the student becoming clingy with you or other school personnel? Again, a way to obtain additional information about the implications of COVID. Okay, so this is the impact profile checklist that I created. And again, this addresses most of what is on those questionnaires. This is really looking at psychosocial, socioeconomic, and educational academic information. So really, I want evaluation personnel to use this prior to conducting formal testing, or support teams to use it prior to referring the student. So I really want to look at what the direct impact of COVID was on the student. Did the student have COVID? If so, what were the details in treatment and recovery? Was an immediate family member diagnosed with COVID? If so, who? What was the outcome? Was the extended family member diagnosed? And was there a death? The death of a close family member or a friend? Psychosocial, looking at whether or not the student was diagnosed with depression or anxiety prior to, and then did the student appear to experience increased anxiety during the COVID-19 self-quarantine? Did the student's sleep patterns change? And then the socioeconomic was looking at whether the child received full, free and reduced lunch prior to COVID, and if so, were they able to obtain lunches during COVID. I know Houston ISD, some of the other schools around this area were still providing drive-ups for getting those free and reduced lunches out to their students. Also looking at whether a family member, a parent, a caregiver lost their jobs, if they've had to rely on food banks. And then this is the educational academic considerations, and this is looking at students' educational trajectory prior to and during COVID. So strengths and weaknesses prior to, strengths and weaknesses during remote instruction, grades prior to, grades after, what was the virtual academic instruction like, and then what was the students' engagement in that learning. So again, these are free for you to use. If you reach out to me, I'd be happy to provide you with a copy. So really, there's a lot for you to consider prior to and during evaluations during this COVID pandemic. So some things I really wanted to summarize is when assessing a student during COVID, it's imperative that the impact of the pandemic on the student be investigated and considered at every point in the assessment process. Part of the way of doing that is being able to collect and integrate multiple sources of data during the determination process. And again, really looking at those exclusionary factors and considering them, ruling them out as the primary cause of struggle. And then really delving deeper, looking deeply into the possible impact that COVID might be having on the students, and then document that throughout the assessment process. Here's our snapshot of our website. We do have a COVID-19 resources directory, so go there. There's some additional information there for you. I have created a Beyond the Score webinar series. This is something that I wanted to do for practitioners during this pandemic, and we've been very successful. I think we've done over 55, 60 webinars since the end of May. One of the webinars that we've been doing that gotten a lot of interest in and a lot of good feedback is on remote testing. So if you're interested in learning more about remote testing and seeing some demo videos of actual testing, feel free to sign up for and join one of our offerings listed here. And this is my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me with any comments or any questions that you might have, anything that I might be able to help you with. I am open to doing so, and look forward to hearing from you. Again, thank you so much for joining this particular presentation today, and I hope that you found this to be helpful, and it has gotten you to kind of think a little more about really understanding some of the COVID and the impact that COVID may be having on our students, and understand the importance of considering those as part of the assessment process. Again, if you want a copy of the COVID checklist, I'd be happy to share that, so send me an email. Thank you so much for your time. Stay safe. Appreciate everything that you do for our students, and I hope to see you in person next year. Thanks.